Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's Prasnatira lecture. Tonight, we're joined by Gary Dempsey. So Gary lectures in Heritage Studies and Design at Galway-Mayo Institute of Technology. He's also creative director at the Digital Heritage Project that most people will be aware of. Tonight, Gary's lecture is entitled Exposing the Exhibitionists, a revision on the study of Sheela-na-Gigs. Gary, you're very welcome to Prasnatira this evening.
Thanks, Liam. It's nice to be here. So you're happy enough for me just to kick off from this point?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All yours, Gary.
Yeah. So as Liam said, the title is Exposing the Exhibitionists. So I guess we're slightly trying to argue that Sheela-na-Gig is not the term we should be using, and we should be broadening our search when we're looking at these. So the project that Digital Heritage Age are working on is called the Sheela-na-Gig 3D project, or the Sheela 3D project. And this is something that we developed back in 2015 with the intention of just focusing on the Irish carvings. And since then, to date, we've recorded 79 what would be classed as Sheela-na-Gig carvings, 10 further exhibitionist carvings, and these can be male or female. To date, just 4 mermaids, so we decided we'd include those because they have partly exhibitionist features. And then we've reclassified 13 carvings that were on the list at some point or were proposed to go onto the list. So we're treating this as kind of a multi-phase project. So each kind of main milestone that we hit off, so that might be a county, or it might be a certain collection, so like the National Museum collection. And then it's primarily focusing on digital recording. And I'll be showing you some of the digital recording as we go through. So the project has a number of core objectives. So while we started with the Irish collection, we do hope to move on to a much broader European collection. And at some stage in the next year, we'll kind of hopefully get to go out and start recording some of those. So we've started beginning this initial research phase at the moment. And I'll show you some of those outputs that we're developing as part of that initial phase. So the goal of Sheela 3D is to provide an open source archive for future researchers on all exhibitionist figures. So hopefully this will be launched, at least the Irish collection, within the next year. And then over the next couple of years, we'll keep adding to that. So part of the project is focusing on 3D recording. So 3D recording can take a couple of different aspects. You might have heard of photogrammetry, which is what we primarily use in our recording, or you might have heard of laser scanning. And in the 30-year celebration of the Discovery Program, you'll see a lot of their fantastic laser scanning work from monuments around the country. So the 3D recording process that we'll mostly use is through digital photographs, and we'll take multiple overlapping photographs of objects, and then we use software to match those images back together. And over time, we've developed a system where we like this kind of black and white look to the images because it strips away all the lichen, it strips away all the color of the stone, and allows you to see that little bit more detail that other researchers in the past haven't pulled out all the detail from the carvings in this way. And like I say, this will be open to the public. Most of the models are online already, but the entire catalog will become open to the public by the end. So let's look at the research of Sheela-na-Gig. So the talk will kind of break down into what the kind of areas that we're looking at that we want people to kind of realize they're the paths you shouldn't be going down. We're looking at Sheela-na-Gigs. And then we'll present a number of paths, which are the possible origins or possible sources for these sites. So in the reason we class everything as an exhibitionist figure inside of the research is that limiting the look or the scope of the project to just Sheela-na-Gigs limits our understanding of what exhibitionist figures were in the past. So how medieval people engaged with these carvings and on what sites they occur on. And one of the biggest problems of the kind of Sheela-na-Gig research has been the name Sheela-na-Gig itself. And almost every author that has studied Sheela-na-Gigs or written about Sheela-na-Gigs have focused on the name at some point. And I'll go through some of that tonight. But I think it's one of the things that we need to start looking away from, because it might be something that we can never fully understand. So the research has tried to look at Irish language, it's tried to look at French, it's tried to look at folk legends around them. It has proven in cases that there have been songs with the term Sheela-na-Gig and a ship called Sheela-na-Gig in use prior to the 1840s. But no one has proven that the term was actually used for carvings prior to the 1840s. And in fact, in the very first paper we get written on Sheela-na-Gigs in 1844, the author of that paper systematically states that R.P. Collis discovered the Rochestown carving, and that was the one that gave the name to all of the others. Even if you read the Ordnance Survey letters, they don't say that themselves. And it wasn't until 1844 that that kind of the Sheela-na-Gig attribute was given at that stage. So we can look here at just kind of the vast number of names that have been given to many of the different carvings. So you can see a large number of these are variations on Sheela-na-Gig, Sheela-na-Gi, Sheela-na-Gluck. A lot of this is drawn from the Sheela-na-Gig project or Sheela-na-Gig.org, which is John Harding's website. And then I've added a few other ones that we've come across. But as you can see, there's a lot of different kind of names being associated with the carvings down throughout the years. One of the very first names to be associated with this style of carving occurs in England. So in the Isle of Wight in 1781, we get the term the idol. The idol is also presented as the name for the Lusk carving in County Dublin, which no longer exists. We get again the name the idol relating to the Isle of Wight. And in 1834, before the Ordnance Survey give us the name Sheela-na-Gig, we're told that at Saor Cairn in County Offaly that the name is the Greek idol or idol associated with the church. The interesting thing is that carving was also called Saint Shanahan, a term that will come up again. So the term idol was applied in a number of ways. In the UK, it's generally to Saxon idols. In Ireland, it's generally applied in the term of Eastern carvings, not to say that the carvings were from an Eastern origin, but as a method of providing a reference for the reader. So there was a large trend in Ireland to kind of suggest people had come from the East, that they hadn't come through England, that they'd come up from Spain or they'd come from France. And these Eastern origins kind of lead themselves into discussions around towers, which it itself leads itself into the early discussions around Sheela-na-Gigs. And in essence, what we're looking at here is a very westernizing of Eastern traditions, something that the writers of the time probably had a rudimentary grasp upon. I would often describe this as, if we were looking at these writings today, there would be blogs by gap year students or writings by men of leisure. So they have the time to be going out and writing these things, but they're generally applying their own ideals onto them. And archaeology has largely moved on from these Victorian views. So while we can still point to early writers as having identified carvings, we've become more nuanced in our thinking and understanding and using scientific methods to analyze these carvings and their possible functions and origins. So if we look at the origins of those terms, like I said, R.P. Collis, he's said to have identified the name at Rochestown in the 1840s, and this is stated in 1844. John O'Donovan and Thomas O'Connor are writing about it in the Ordnance Survey letters in the 1840s. But prior to all of this, there are a number of carvings known about, and they're in Dean Dawson's collection, the Dean of St. Patrick's Church in Dublin. And on the 24th of October in 1840, Dean Dawson dies. That's only days after John O'Donovan and Thomas O'Connor are writing in the Ordnance Survey letters themselves. So the term is only being written down around the same week that Dean Dawson has actually died. And it's the Dawson collection that becomes the RIA Museum, which becomes the National Museum of Ireland much later. And it's this collection that Clibborn is talking about when he's writing in 1844. He's specifically referencing the the RIA Dawson collection. And when you look at those very early records, you'll often see Dawson written next to them, the early carvings that we had in the collection. And there was no mention of Sheela-na-Gig in those early records. Freetag notes that O'Donovan calls the carvings at Shin Castle in County Leash Sheela-na-Gig, or says that there was also a Sheela there. But it's very likely that O'Connor is using this term to apply it to carvings that he's seen before. And Freetag also notes that Curry fails to mention the carving at Kilnaboy. I think this is kind of in an example of how their morals might have made them overlook some of these carvings and why they don't occur in the Ordnance Survey record prior to Tipperary. However, the Ordnance Survey record does record the carving at Kilnaboy. It's just that they called it a dwarf or a stunted man on a piece of stone over the door. What Collis and the survey team was looking at is the image that you can see in front of you. And even this probably has a little bit more light than you will generally get on that church down in County Clare. But when we applied 3D recording methods to that, you can clearly see it is an exhibitionist figure, and probably slightly earlier than the church that you're visiting today, the 15th century rebuilding of that church. So it's been replaced into the doorway there. In relation to Coll's visit to Dowth, so this is, again, the visit is happening before the Ordnance Survey are writing, but it's not published until after that date. So the publication comes out and uses the term Sheela-na-Gig, referring to a living woman. Now we'll come up against this again a little bit later on, and we spend quite a bit of time looking at this kind of idea of the living woman and the references to this in the past. Also, Coll's writing specifically points to cures for the evil eye, and he seems to be speaking about prostitution. He's kind of going on talking about harlots and Babylon and other things within his writing just after he explains why he went to Dowth to see this Sheela-na-Gig. This is actually the Dowth figure today, mutilated and hacked away, but early carving or early photographs that we have of it show a much more detailed image. As I mentioned earlier on, the Dowth carving, when we see that in 1844 in Clibburn's article, and again, I'm not 100% sure if Clibburn wrote the article or was this just a representation of the talk that he gave to the RIA, but in that article it stated that the Dowth carving is identified as Saint Shanahan. So this is a name again that will come up in County Tipperary, where we have Shanahan as a townland name and a church name, and we have carvings there. So this kind of moves us on to some of the research that we've been looking at ourselves and trying to break down some of the things that we're seeing inside of historical reports. So some of the very early writing in 1842 by Coll and John O'Donovan in the 1840s proposes that Sheela-na-Gig is an insult in some way. So we learn that from John O'Donovan that Sheela-na-Gig was a character such as Gráinne Whale or Gráinne O'Malley was in Connacht. And the carving is on this castle, or sorry, on the church in Kiltinnan to annoy the descendants of Sheela-na-Gig. We see, again, Coll just saying that, or Coll's informer telling him that the carving is to answer the purposes of living women and in terms of curing the evil eye. We see this trend show up again and again in folklore collections. So in the Schools collection, which is a fantastic collection that I've spent an awful lot of time going through, pulling out very, very small references to minute things that might link to Sheela-na-Gigs. Two things that kind of stood out. One was proposed to me by Neil Jackman of Abarta Heritage, who said, have you heard of a carving in Leitrim near the Abbey of Creeleva up by Dromahair? And there's supposedly a carving of a woman with her tongue hanging out. Could this be a Sheela-na-Gig? So I went and had a look at the reference, and it's interesting in that it is a woman who refuses a dispossessed priest a drink of water and sticks out her tongue at him And then this carving, or this stone carving, is meant to represent the woman whose face was stuck in that position. We see a grotesque head on a bridge down in Tipperary, I think just between Waterford and Tipperary. And the head is said to have been a representation of the cook of the castle, who refused the masons good food. And in their spite, the masons carved the head of the woman and placed it on the castle. At some point, it migrates down to the bridge beside the mills, and it's said it's given its own unique name of Jane Squibbs. So while we're talking about carved heads here, we are talking about medieval carvings that people are associating folk tales and folk narratives around. And when we look into the Sheela-na-Gig collection a little bit more, we see very similar tales showing up. So in 1892, we get the story of the Sheela-na-Gig at Ballynahinch Castle, just outside of Cashel in Tipperary. And in that record, we're told that the figure is a carving of the cook, or a caricature of the cook, in revenge for incivility to the tradespeople employed building the castle. So again, she refused them good food when they were hungry. And the masons take it upon themselves to caricature the woman and place her on the castle as an insult. What's interesting about this, again, it shows up in 1892, long before the schools collection. And a note at the bottom says that there is a similar legend at Ardfinnan, and the Ardfinnan is where we find Jane Squibb's head on the bridge. Moving on to a slightly different insult, we again see in the schools collection, referring to Ballyfinboy Castle, where the Sheela-na-Gig is often referred to as the dancer. We see that the woman in this case, or the carving in this case, is of a woman who refused soldiers a drink. And we have to assume at this period of time that they're referring to English soldiers. And they may have taken over the castle and carved this effigy of a woman, again, to spite this woman who refused them a drink. And again, that's going back to that woman at the well refusing the priest to drink. And this theme will pop up a little bit later on again. We see a slight variation on this, and I have to confirm with Jim Higgins whether I've got the story right here, or whether, again, it is a woman who's carved by the English soldiers. But when Jim Higgins showed me the plaster cast of this carving at Tockboy in County Roscommon, he told me that the carving, or the local tradition says, the carving was of a woman who'd been excommunicated from the church for helping the English soldiers. And again, the carving was put on the gable end to insult that woman's family. What's interesting about this carving, it's on that kind of gable capstone on the end of the building. We'll see at least 2 or 3 more of those inside of the Sheela-na-Gig's collection. And the majority of these gable ends would have also had a church cross placed into them in a socket on top of those. So we see similar carvings like this in reuse, again, time and time again. I've been told by Christy Caniff this is kind of a symbolism of the church's power over whatever this carving is meaning. The final kind of folk tradition that we get around Sheela-na-Gigs relates to kind of a tyrannical owner of the castle. So in County Laois, we have a carving where it is Sheela O'Dwyer, who's said to have married the original owner of the castle. He soon dies, and in her kind of grief and rage and a need to protect herself, she becomes a tyrannical mistress of the land. And the carving is put on the castle as a warning, kind of not to turn into this woman. We see a similar folktale to Ballinacarriga in County Cork, where despite the carving being female, the story is representative of a male figure. It's supposedly around the male owner of the castle. But there are suggestions, some beautiful carvings inside that castle, and some beautiful religious artwork up in the very top level. But inside the same folk collections, we do see that there is a carving of the woman and her children. So whether there's a mix-up of the Sheela-na-Gig should be the woman on the outside that the folk tale is referring to, or whether it's one of the other carvings inside. But again, these are things that people wouldn't have direct access to all the time. And they're often quite invisible when you're coming to see these castles. So I think we spent a very long time looking for Ballycarriga. We managed to get inside the castle through borrowing the key from the OBW. And it was only after about half an hour we realized it was above us on the door as we were entering in. What we're seeing here is a common theme running throughout folklore and antiquarian writings, demonstrating that potentially the original meaning of these carvings are long forgotten, but certainly in the 1800s and 1900s, there are new folk versions or narratives that occur. And the same effect can be seen for other grotesque carved heads, be they attributed to saints, be they attributed to Crom Dove or another similar character, or to a local person. When you examine these type of heads, and they're often classed as Sheela-na-Gigs as a grotesque carving, and this is just the style of the time, often kind of striated necks and straining, and they're often in stones that weather quite easily. So it's not always evident what the stone is actually representing. But when you compare those to the smooth medieval heads on other later medieval churches, or the improved stonework on the buildings that these have often been put into, you can see how folk narratives would have developed around a carving that stood out from everything else around us. Another part of this folk tradition, and it's over the last few years, every time around March 18th, either someone rings me or invites me to come to a Sheela-na-Gig event. And I've kind of been confused at some points as to why this happens, and kind of interested in other points as to why it happens. But if you look at there's this tradition that Sheela-na-Gig and St. Patrick are linked within folk tales. And there's some really interesting stuff from Newfoundland that links Sheila's Day and St. Patrick's wife, and this very, very much folk tradition of the 19th century, the 18th and 19th century. So there's been a number of publications down throughout the years. In the 70s, Herbert Halper gave this paper on those Sheela Day and Sheela as Patrick wife tradition in a conference in Newfoundland. During that conference, somebody in the audience, during the Q&A afterwards, Alison Feeder, in fact, suggested that the Sheela-na-Gigs may be connected to Halpert's stories. And it should be pointed out, Halpert thought these associations with Sheila's Day and Sheela-na-Gig were not of Irish origin, and that generally they occurred in Newfoundland and other English writers. So he couldn't find an Irish connection to them at that time. And he never knew while he was giving this talk initially that there was such a thing as Sheela-na-Gigs, but he does include it in the publication afterwards as an interesting kind of discussion that happened at the event. Some interesting things that he does write about in that publication is he's given a number of the accounts of the narrative of Sheila's Day and Sheila's brush and other things associated with Sheela and March 18th. So Sheila's brush is kind of this storm that builds up sometime around Patrick's Day, and this is generally a name given to it. Again, in England and Newfoundland, and not very much in Ireland, although we do see very, very slight references to it in that terms. But the narrative kind of says that a woman, St. Patrick asks this woman as he's passing by, can he have a drink of water? And she gives him either soapy water or she doesn't give him water. And in spite and vengeance, as the folk St. Patrick often is, he brings up a big storm so that her clothes can't be dried. Now, this is very much, you can see the 18th, 19th century aspects of this here. And you can tell that the origins are within those periods just by breaking down the narratives of the story. But what Halpert points out is that there is a very interesting story where we see Jesus as the figure who comes along on Good Friday and asks a woman for a drink of water. And again, we get this kind of soapy water, or the woman refuses him a drink. And again, he causes a storm. So we get these folk narratives building up, and what we can see from them is that the characters inside of these stories are substituted. So in England, it might be Jesus. In Ireland, it might be St. Patrick or another local saint. Somewhere else, we might have someone else associated with this. So again, it's not something that's specific to this case alone, but it's something that can be found within multiple folk traditions, and shows this kind of similar kind of morals or lessons that we can learn from these folk stories. So potentially in this case, don't refuse someone a drink of water, or always be nice to somebody, because you never know who it's going to be. I mean, you can see these narratives in the Bible, you can see them in folk religious stories down throughout history. And I know I grew up on certain stories about strangers coming to the door and being turned away, and it turns out the stranger is Jesus, or the stranger is somebody, and they would have brought a blessing upon the house. So these very Irish morals that we're not to turn people away from our door are being shown up in things like this. So there are 2 articles then published in 2017 and 2019. So the 2017, they're both based off the work of Shane Lahan, and I have yet to be able to find the original research on this, or any sort of publication outside of the Irish Times. So the original article states that St. Patrick had a wife and her name was Sheela. It goes on about the traditions of Patrick's wife and some of the folklore, and caused kind of lots of kind of media storms, or social media storms, shall we say, around the time. In 2019, then Lahan publishes a second article and says that the headlines were misleading, is often the case of the Irish Times, that they do have misleading headlines, but that we should be focusing on more of the connection between Sheela-na-Gig and St. Patrick. And I've attempted to do this. I've looked at as many references as I can, but I can't see a link outside of those suggestions at conferences that, oh, you're talking about Sheila's Day. I know something called the Sheela-na-Gig. They're nudie women on churches and castles in Ireland. They must be connected. And this is kind of how the original discussion went. And Halper just kind of brushed it aside, but included it. Now, Lahan does point to a number of references to Sheila's Day. And these are quite interesting. I've yet to find the 1785 reference that he gives, or he just notes that in the Freeman's Journal in 1785, it occurs there. But this is just a brief kind of list of random dates that Sheila's Day appears, and I've been able to find a reference to each of these days. And the majority of them are very, very fleeting and passing references. So in 1811, the Sheila's Day appears in an advert for a new ballet or performance that will take place on March 16th called Sheila's Day or Erin go Bra. So it's nobody associating the term Sheila's Day with March 18th or Sheela-na-Gigs. It's the actual name of a ballet that is going to be performed in Dublin Castle. In 1829, we get the story of British soldiers dressed as St. Patrick and Sheela, and Barbara Freetag published this in her book. I think 1839 was the reference she used, but said this was a reprint from 1829. The most common reference to Sheila's Day that we have is generally in court cases. So we have one in 1838, where a woman is arrested for drunken behavior, I believe along with her husband and her children. And she says to the arresting officer, I promise that for St. Patrick's Day or Sheila's Day, the first woman says, blow the new police, the magistrates and the parents act to smithereens. She would maintain her rights to keep Sheila's Day and make Lough Erne ring. So we have this tradition of very drunk people on the 18th of March that are arrested. And we have at least this woman in 1838 said to have used the term Sheila's Day towards the arresting officer. Because what we're reading here is the arresting officer's report to the court. In 1839, again, it shows up as a reference in the Freeman's Journal, very fleeting and passing. somebody is at an event in Newfoundland, they're invited to a dinner on Monday, and in brackets, Sheila's Day. So again, very fleeting and gives us no information as to any of the connections in Newfoundland or anything around the day itself. In 1841, we see a second woman who's arrested for, again, drunken behavior. And in the court, she says to the judge, "I promise that for St. Patrick's Day or Sheila's Day or any other day in the calendar, I shall never stand in your presence again." And again, passing kind of fleeting thing, but we do see people using the term Sheila's Day. We see it again in a court report when several people are arrested on March 18th, Sheila's Day. And again, this is coming from the police. We see it in the Catholic Layman, where they mentioned that a highwayman, Michael Collins, was arrested on Sheila's Day. And I don't think they gave a date, but they might have done. But what this is implying is that people understand when Sheila's Day is. And then in 1915, we get a report in the Drogheda Independent from the Old Castle Court, where people have been drinking on Sheila's Day. And the statement, again, coming from the police, is there is no reason for these parties getting drink on the 18th of March, which was Sheila's Day. So certainly in the police's mind, we shouldn't all be getting drunk on the 18th of March, and we shouldn't be having to show up in court in the weeks following. But we're not seeing any sort of reference to Sheela-na-Gig inside of anything here. We're not seeing references to Saint Sheela in anything that's happening here. So Barbara Freetag, in her 2004 publication, mentions the Sheela and Patrick connection. She doesn't go as far as to say that Sheela-na-Gig is definitely connected with it, but she tries to use this, or Sheila's brush, as a method of explaining Sheela-na-Gig, or a possibility of explaining Sheela-na-Gig. So she points towards Dineen's dictionary, where Dineen uses the word gig, among other things. So gig means stick or branch. It can mean a branch of a family, of genealogy. It can be a compliment, as in the good kind of branch of the family, or like a compliment towards good looks. So it doesn't sound like it's intended for Sheela-na-Gig. Whenever I look at Irish terms, I immediately go to the Electronic Dictionary of Irish Language online, so just DIL. So I was confused as to why I couldn't find gig inside of the dictionary, especially considering Dineen had given a reference to that, and Dineen is sometimes referenced in there. So they pointed out that the word is actually gek, can come from geg, but also that Dineen is very much speaking about modern Irish and modern translations, and what we see on the EDIL records is largely the medieval or the pronunciations that we might have had in medieval. So we have to be very careful when using Dineen. Freetag mentions that one of these meanings of gig can mean an image of a girl made for a festival. Dineen associates this with August, I think the 10th of August, and the May festival. He also connects it to Omeed, to a very specific place. So that's something that it kind of all came together in the last few days as I was writing this, and I was able to get a lot of the references kind of pulled together. So potentially there might be something there around Omeed that might help us to understand better what type of images are being produced, and if we could link those to Sheela-na-Gigs. And hopefully later on as well, I'll be able to show that we need to be very, very careful when we use the word images when we're talking about Sheela-na-Gigs, because they suggest something else. So the Sheela and Patrick connection, what can we really say about this? Well, we can say that March 18th was sometimes called Sheila's Day in Ireland. The tradition is much more common in Newfoundland. The writing that we see from England around this time is very suspect. They're kind of these calendars and things that people are putting together, and they're not the best sources to be referencing in this case. And Halper pretty much said that himself, that these kind of calendars and saints' days that we're seeing listed, they're not really accurate references that we can say anything here about. So we should point out very, very clearly that when we talk about St. Patrick in this case, we talk about a folk St. Patrick, not any historical figure who wrote a series of letters that we can attribute to an early Christian figure in Ireland, but the folk hagiography and folk traditions that came out of that figure. The only links between carved figures and Sheela's day come from the ponderings of kind of academics at conferences. And we would assume that if there is some tradition of this, we would see some evidence on at least one of the carvings being called Saint Sheela. But instead, when we see the carvings associated with saints, they are male saints. When we see the carvings associated with Bridget or Gobnus, they are at sites traditionally linked to Bridget and Gobnus. So the association is backwards there, as in there's a carving at St. Bridget's site, it's a carving of St. Bridget, rather than the carving of at this site is St. Bridget, thus the site gets its name. There are also problems with things like Gobnus herself, in that the Sheela-na-Gig at Ballyvorney might not be a Sheela-na-Gig and doesn't show many of the traditional Sheela-na-Gig elements that we would actually see there. So the next kind of area that I wanted to look at is something, again, that's kind of bothered me in the research of Sheela-na-Gigs again and again, just because of how many writers have referenced this. So in 1981, Patrick Cornish published 3 references referencing Sheela-na-Gigs as he writes it in his book. He doesn't give us the sources to the references. We have to really go looking for those. He implies that the Latin translations which his sources come from say Sheela-na-Gigs, and his interpretation has been largely recreated in other people's writing to suggest that there was wood or that Sheela-na-Gigs were burnt. The 3 passing references he gives are in 1631 to the Statutes of Tuam, where we get the Latin written out and in the vernacular Sheela-na-Gigs inside of his publication. In 1676, he says that Bishop Brennan in Waterford is ordering Sheela-na-Gigs to be burnt. And in 1687, he says that the Kilmore Diocesan Synod references living Sheela-na-Gigs. So I went to the trouble of having the Latin translated, managed to track it down after about 3 years, and found a published record of it. So there's all the synods of Ireland, they're published somewhere in a Latin format, and you just need to get them translated in detail. So the Tuam reference, I asked Dr. Francis Young to translate these for me. He translated as distended images of unpleasant aspect are concealed in a convenient place by the shepherds or priests of the respective place, so that it is established by registered letters where they would now be hidden and whom should to such things belonged. So we get a couple of really interesting things out of this. We understand that the Statutes of Tuam, these are kind of enacting the Council of Trent in Ireland. And the statutes are basically, in one line, one of the rules here is that new priests or the priests of the area are to take any images of unpleasant aspect or distended, which is, we can use the term fat or stout or distended for the images of Bess. But the fact that they're to be hidden away and a record of who they belong to made, that it all becomes quite interesting when we look at that, because we're not talking about something that belongs to the church and is part of the fabric of the church. Because if we were to take a Sheela-na-Gig out of the church, the whole gable end might collapse. So, like, a lot of these are on coinstones, so you take that out and you've got to replace it again. They do sound like transportable objects, and they don't sound like they're destroying them. They're keeping a record of where they're being hidden and who they originally belonged to. We see in the diocesan statutes of Ossory, and these are the kind of references that we get to living Sheela-na-Gigs that Cornish is kind of bringing up, and his burning of Sheela-na-Gigs. But we see that the church is largely concerned with withholding sermons or rites of the church from sinners, adulterers, usurpers, drunkards, enchanters, magical tricksters, soothsayers, basically anyone that the church wouldn't really want coming into it. And there we see kind of people kind of using folk herbs and traditions as well, but no mention of living Sheela-na-Gigs here. We do see in Ossory a similar to command, and this is where we're supposed to get the burning of the images. So we have two translations of this, one by Forstill in 1998, who says the images may be destroyed and new ones substituted in their place. And then Dr. Francis Young, who's translated it as the images ought to be decently buried and new, and again, we have to insert the word images here, supplied in their place. So like Tuam as well, we're not completely destroying something, but we're actually replacing it within the church record here. So again, it doesn't seem like they're replacing a fragment of the church which belongs to the church, but something that is being used outside of it. So we're getting removal of statues and we're getting replacement of statues. And these might be statues that have just become old and malformed, as the translation says here, or they might be unpleasant subjects that the church no longer want to put forward, or they might be those representations of breedogs that people would have put outside their doors on certain festivals of the years. Folk religious items that are being created that the church no longer want in use because they're aiming at this point to gain back control. The living Sheela-na-Gigs comes from this passage here, which is the Diocese of Kilmore. And this has bothered me for a long time because the word Grador is untranslatable, or for a long time was untranslatable. It's certainly not Latin. It's not necessarily Irish, and it's not Anglo-Norman. And I've looked at all of those options along. And it was only when I reached out to a researcher, Deborah Hayden, to discuss impotence and references to impotence in medieval text, that she came back and said, have you looked at the word gestor? So I might be mispronouncing that very, very badly. It seems possible. It's an enchanter or a sorceress or sorcerer. And again, superstitious enchanter or exorcist. And it's in relation to a religious context. And when we actually look at who writes this, it is the Bishop of Kilmore in 1685, 2 years before we see it in those diocesan synods. So we know that this term Grador is being used in Kilmore, around Cavan and Monaghan region at that time. The final passage which Cornish kind of points to is the Statutes of Waterford and Lismore. And again, we can't really see anything outside of the practice of kind of folk medicine here. So overall, we can say that there is no reference to Sheela-na-Gig in these references, that Cornish placed the term Sheela-na-Gig onto his translation. And we've used this to suggest that we should have wooden Sheela-na-Gigs, that we should have burnt icons, and that they were ordering these statues to be turned away and hidden from the church. And while Sheela-na-Gigs might fall into what they were actually talking about, I don't believe that the Sheela-na-Gig carvings that we have today are representative of what these statutes are actually talking about. So again, these are the kind of references that we get coming up and again. We get the living women, which is Grador or Geistor, enchanter or sorceress, and we get Call referring to that and then linking it to prostitution. And then we get religious lay images that might be, they could actually be carried around by people who are priests but are not part of the formal church. And the wider context of those Latin documents talks a lot about people enacting orders and rites, specifically baptisms, marriages, and burials, where these people are not priests or not considered to be priests, And a lot of the time, what they might have been referencing is the Augustinians, the Cistercians, and the Franciscans, who were showing up at churches, collecting alms during masses around this time. And the forming established church that we're getting from this period aren't too happy with this. So it's quite possible that these people are carrying around statues like Goblet's statue in Cork, and the church isn't quite happy with the way these monastic orders are dealing with the laity and engaging with the laity. So we'll move on to part of what's emerging from some of our research today. So because we're recording all the sites, we're keeping a detailed record of everything that we do as we record them, and we're able to start to analyze our findings as we go along. So this map and the chart next to it are kind of an update of Niall Kenny's work, who in 2007 published a kind of a survey of Sheela-na-Gigs and showed their associations with castles, tower houses, and other sites. We've slightly updated that. So whereas Kenny showed 43 sites at churches and 42 at castles, we now have 55 at castles and 65 at churches. This can be slightly explained in that we've discovered more carvings, and also in our research, we've removed anything at a well because the well is a secondary use, and any association with the well is a secondary association for the carving. So we try and determine what is the most logical site that would have been associated with in the area, be that a church or a castle. That still leaves us with 25 sites that we can't identify, we can't know about. A couple of anomalies, like we have town walls. We have 2 carvings associated with town walls, most likely both in a secondary position. A round tower, we have carvings in secondary positions in round towers, and a bishop's palace, again, likely a secondary position in the bishop's palace. When we start to break these down by date, so we can use those sites then that we've associated these carvings with, and we can say, what is the earliest point that this site would have occurred? So we can see that in castles, you're seeing Sheela-na-Gigs used around the 15th and 16th century primarily. In churches, you get a much broader range, right, from the 12th up to the 16th century. And I'm expecting that when we break that down a little bit more, we look at secondary replacement into walls and we try and redefine those dates a bit better, that we will get 2 dates showing up there, that we will get dates in the 12th and 13th centuries, and we will get dates in the 15th and 16th, with kind of a flyover in the 14th. Unknown on these maps just refers to the site types. So we just don't know the site types. And I'm not counting, again, secondary associations. When we break the classes down, so like I said earlier on, we're using the National Monuments classification system, and then we're adding in mermaids as a separate class into this, generally because they're not individually recorded as a carving type in Ireland. So we can see here that we have 123 Sheela-na-Gigs, or female exhibitionists. We have, 17 exhibitionist figures, which can be male and female. So some of the Sheela-na-Gigs that people would know, things like the Nuns' Church at Clonmacnoise, are classed as exhibitionist figures. And then we began to record modern carvings as well, and where these are actually showing up. In case they ever get added to an official record, we have a record of these are modern carvings, they're not historical carvings. But they are interesting to note that there is a continuation of Sheela-na-Gig carving happening. So when we break this down by classification and date, we see that 123 Sheela-na-Gigs are recorded, including all of the missing ones that have ever been reported. That the majority of sites that these can be associated with are in the 15th century, and we see a growth in use from the 12th to the 13th century with a fall off in the 16th century. Again, we have 2 anomalies here, one associated with a round tower. The date is being kept for that at the moment, but it is a secondary use. The style of the Sheela-na-Gig does not fit an 11th or 12th century round tower. And the 16th century is the Bishop's Palace, which I'm pretty sure is a secondary use. We just need to examine that carving in a bit more detail. So when we begin to split the Sheela-na-Gig, so those 123 carvings up by sites, we can see that there is actually an equal split between castle and church distribution. And again, we've removed holy wells or wells from this, and we've tried to associate the carvings with the most logical site that they would have come from in that area, based on the style of the carving, the type of stone, and when we can record churches or castles for that area. And again, we have a large proportion here that we just don't know about, and a lot of the sites we could be talking about secondary use within the building fabric of town walls, and we could be talking certainly about secondary use in round towers there. So if we look at another common theory that's said about Sheela-na-Gigs, is that they come with the Normans into Ireland. So if we use the class Sheela-na-Gig, then this is true. All of the carvings of Sheela-na-Gigs occur after the Norman arrival into Ireland. But there are carvings that are exhibitionist that occur beforehand. An interesting thing to note about the maps at the moment is that there are no Sheela-na-Gigs in the southeast, but we can trace the Norman expansion across Ireland by the 1250s. We have 13 carvings that can be datable to this period, all falling within this Norman expansion. When we expand it out to the 1300s, a further 18 carvings are datable to this period, and they all occur within Norman expansion. And then the majority of carvings appear after the 1400s. Again, we have a couple of anomalies and a couple of problems here. We have those carvings in the large kind of swath of the northwest there, and you have carvings in County Clare and down in Cork. That one's in Cork. That those carvings fall outside of Norman expansion, but potentially not influence. So our mapping system is based that we are looking at exhibitionists in all forms. And when you look at Ireland, you get some interesting pictures and you can see, oh, there's a big gap here in the southeast. But if you start looking at England, or you look at England, Scotland, and Wales, then you see that there's a wider spread of these carvings. And you see that many of the carvings there are datable. So we know the date of the buildings that they were on, and that they're dating to the 12th century. So we're getting a kind of an origin point for these carvings within the UK and Ireland sometime around the 12th century. And this is including many of what we would class as the Romanesque carvings. We can then expand our research out even more, and again, just counting exhibitionist figures. So these are drawn from a number of different maps. The work of Anthony Weir, the work of John Harding for the UK, and then a couple of other random reported sites that I picked up along the way, or from publications that I picked up along the way, that I've included those as exhibitionist carvings. But you can see that 145 exhibitionists in Ireland is close up behind by 111 in the UK. I've included Jersey in the French count because it makes more sense. And then we can see that France, the north of Spain, Portugal, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden. But again, this is only just showing us part of the picture. And this is the problem with maps. While they're very useful for creating these patterns, they show patterns of things that we only know about. So in the case of Sheela-na-Gigs, we know that there are certain carvings in these areas, and then we can expand that out. But if you think about this, as archaeologists, the gaps are not evidence of no sites. They're just an indication that we've yet to identify evidence for carvings in these places. And to put that into context, when I started college, human activity in Ireland began sometime around 9,000 years ago. We've recently learned from bare bones in County Clare that human activity began 2,500 years ago. And we've even more recently learned from research down in, I think it was Cork or Kerry, that humans arrived in Ireland 33,000 years ago. It's likely we could find evidence that humans were here 50,000 years ago at some point. The point is that these gaps are only gaps until we fill them in, until we find something that redirects the knowledge that we know. And that's a fundamental part of the understanding of archaeology. So in the next couple of slides, maybe about 10 or 20 or so, I'm going to look at the research and kind of give a leaning one way or the other if this is a possible origin for Sheela-na-Gigs. There are a large number of competing strands for authenticity within the Sheela-na-Gig research. Largely, publications have been based outside of academic research, which is good in certain senses, but it also means that scrutiny that would have been placed on the academic readings of carvings is pushed aside. And you see things like Freetag's book saying archaeologists haven't looked at them, to which Niall Kenny wrote his article in 2007 going, yes, we have. We've looked at them an awful lot, and these are the things that we came up with. That it's probably a case of not making our research open access, not having things out there in the public that people can easily access, that there is a kind of an assumption that archaeologists aren't interested in these carvings. And I do think even within the academic writings, there is a tendency to kind of have wild or loosely claimed conclusions that are often presented in opening chapters or in opening paragraphs of readings. So one of the main things that we see again and again when we look at Sheela-na-Gig research is that they somehow have a pagan or a Celtic past. And we cannot even just attribute to this to writers who are writing for specific audience that would seek out that type of work. And there's great kind of feminist writers out there that kind of point to the similarity of carvings that we see. Even Etienne Rynn, eminent archaeologist in Ireland, and Edith Guest, one of the eminent writers of Sheela-na-Gigs, and even Jorgen Andersen wrote about influences that Eastern figures might have had on Sheela-na-Gigs, to the point where some call them fertility goddess and some call them other things. But associating exhibitionist figures from Western Europe and medieval sites with prehistoric or ancient Eastern iconography can be useful, but it can also be very dangerous. So it's useful in that it demonstrates a tradition of similar artistic outputs among different cultures. It's dangerous as that it's a suggestion of an adoption of these carvings based on Christian iconography, and it ignores the social context of medieval masons, church builders, the laity, the patrons who paid for these churches, and how these people engage with the wider exhibitionist carvings in their daily lives. We see today that the chalk carving in England of the man with the club and the very large penis, that is not a pagan carving. It's not a late medieval carving, that they've dated it to the early medieval period. And again, gaps in the research can only be filled by studying these things. So again, the understanding of the lives of these people and how they engage with sites is something that we need to begin to understand. We have to develop an understanding of the societal constructs and the religious lives of medieval people. And we cannot really use the Victorian or early modern Christian values to kind of project back onto those and explain that, oh, it's old and I don't understand it, so it must be pagan. Francis Young, who I asked to do the translations, he has a very good article on the myths of medieval pagans, where he suggests that we need to look at the so-called pagan practices of products of an imperfectly chastised Christian churches. And again, those Latin texts that we were translating demonstrate this chastising of the churches in brilliant form. And this is where people have pointed to in the past, those images being Sheela-na-Gigs. We can then tag things as Sheela-na-Gigs, create associations that others might then use to develop links further back. But some of the images here that I have, they've at one time or another been called a Sheela-na-Gig. You have the cartridge stones, which are in a graveyard in Limerick, which are very much 19th century burial tomb context. And they look very similar to the cat stone, which is in Cashel, which O'Donovan called a pagan carving. But these are 19th century people putting these very Greek style carvings on their gravestones in a Western context, probably not fully understanding what the carvings were originally. And they're supposed to be angels in some shape or form. We have the Kilgobbin stone, which most people will know as step-aside, which for a long time writers would class as a Sheela-na-Gig. But when we visited, we noticed this little circle on the back, which had been pointed out by other writers before. And the 3D survey of that proved that this is a cross. It's a figurative cross, and there are 2 carvings on either side. So again, not a Sheela-na-Gig carving, most likely marking a grave, so not a pagan carving either. We see the Boa Island and Lusty Moor figures, and again associated with Sheela-na-Gigs, but again, nothing to say that these carvings are Sheela-na-Gigs or anything to do with them. I have questions against their pagan origins in that we find them in Christian sites, and potentially the gap at the very top of the Janus figure, the jewel-faced figure, could have been a slot for a cross. We see these jewel-faced figures in other sites. So if you go to Jerpoint Abbey, you will see 3-faced men and 2-faced men on some of the cloister buildings there as well. So it's not beyond the realm of medieval Christian art to see these type of carvings. So if we kind of put the Celtic origin or the pagan origin aside, we can then begin to look at some of the other origins. And some people have suggested that they may be a fertility goddess. We could probably take the word goddess out there and look at fertility symbol and potentially say there could be something in this. Outside of the female writers on this, a lot of the writers have been male, and they're the same type of people that will see a phallic stone in every field that they go to, or prehistoric site where the sun enters the tomb. And there's a lot of kind of problems in their writing and their research that I think anyone that sees a standing stone in the field and says there's a phallic stone might need to see a doctor in some way, because all standing stones look something like that. In terms of sources for the folk traditions, Guest does point out that there is a fertility argument, especially when she points towards Ballyvorney or St. Gobnitz in Cork. And then we do see a strong folk tradition in Sligo, which is the larger carving here with the X on the side of it, that the people who own that carving will tell you that there is a tradition of people rubbing that carving for fertility, and that their family and the family that lived there previously have multiple children, like as in twins and triplets and quadruplets. So there is a tradition there, but cause and effect would need to actually be proven there in all essence. Rosemary Parrow, who's written on the Iona Sheela-na-Gig, she makes a very good point that Margaret Murphy, who Eva Guest based a lot of her research on, and a lot of the other English writers based their research on, that her fertility arguments have largely been disproven by more modern research. She also makes a very valid comment that the theories of carvings can only be supported by a proportion of the surviving carvings, while other carvings weaken the argument. And this is something that we'll see again and again cropping up. We can look at the Sheela-na-Gig, Sheila's Day, St. Patrick's wife arguments. And I've yet to be convinced that we can link Sheela-na-Gigs to this folk tradition of Sheila's Day. Like I say, Freetag includes some kind of interesting notes and points towards Deneen's dictionary. But as I mentioned earlier, we need to be very careful about Deneen because he's writing in modern Irish, and his notes aren't that historical, whereas the electronic dictionary of Irish language or the Anglo-Norman dictionary, they use historical notes. And there was probably some validity in somebody taking up the research of going through manuscripts, looking for references that we could link to things like Sheela-na-Gig. But you might be looking for a very long time for that type of connection. Looking at our own research in terms of, is Sheela-na-Gig an insult? Is it insulting a woman or a group of women in some way? And what I find this extremely fascinating, and I love the folk traditions that I'm finding when I'm doing this research. I think it's largely 18th to 19th century folk tales, and that these stories tell us how the carvings are reused and reinterpreted over time, but they're not really helping us to understand much about the carvings. They do give an insight into how people engage with them, and I think some people have overlooked the folk aspect. So things like the Dune carving, the folklore around that. I'll mention that a little bit later on, but the things that we can draw from those folk aspects might help us understand Sheela-na-Gigs a little bit more. We look at the biggest argument, and this is the one that is generally put forward by archaeologists in Ireland, and potentially rightfully so, but there are some problems with it. So the Normans gave us Sheela-na-Gigs. We can say that the Normans come to Ireland in 1169, but if we class the Nuns' Island Chapel at Clonmacnoise, which is built in 1167, as Sheela-na-Gig, as I say, it's classed as an exhibitionist figure officially. But if we class that as a Sheela-na-Gig, then we have Sheela-na-Gigs prior to the arrival of the Normans. What we don't have is Sheela-na-Gigs prior to the arrival of the monastic orders in Ireland. So the Cistercians who arrived at Mellifont in 1142, they likely inspired the building of the Nuns' Chapel and the work that was going on there. So while the Nuns' Chapel is Romanesque in style and Hiberno-Romanesque, there has been suggestions that those masons who were working on Mellifont may have been working on the Nuns' Chapel at the same time. So we could be talking about, rather than the Normans brought Sheela-na-Gigs to Ireland, that there is a large European influence on the building style and the sculptured stone in Ireland. And this is where we get things like acrobatic figures coming in. But we can't completely look towards that, because we have to say the UK clearly have Sheela-na-Gig carvings on corbel tables before we can date any in Ireland. We can look at some of the problematic carvings that we have. So again, the Clonmacnoise, which is the little lozenge-shaped carving there, second from the left. The Rath in County Clare, a fascinating carving that not too many writers spend a lot of time on, but this is a Sheela-na-Gig style carving showing two beasts beside the figure and another beast biting into the groin. And occurs very much in a Romanesque context. So it's on a Romanesque window with a large dragon with vine leaf coming out that we could argue is the devil, or we could argue is a representation of a green man. But sadly, we don't have any more of that Romanesque carving from that site. And it would be amazing to have seen what this looked like in its original form. I've included Ratu in County Clare here, as kind of these predating Normans. That's that kind of knees apart, feet together figure just at the bottom. And that's problematic in terms of its headdress is not an 11th century headdress. We can probably suggest that that was 14th to 15th century insertion into the north window of that round tower. And no one saw it before this, because it's a round tower and it's a tiny window at the top. And it was only when they put scaffolding up and somebody physically went up to the window that they found it. The carving that we have up in County Cavan, which is said to be, again, I think it's St. Bricken, who is holding a skull in one hand and a saw in another hand. This is a male exhibitionist figure, and the earliest male exhibitionist figure that we have in Ireland. And then we have the lay carving from County Tipperary, or Lathmore carving, which is lying on its side in a doorway nowadays. And again, some fantastic representation of Romanesque styles there. I would question if it comes from the church it is currently on, and it would be fascinating if it came from a doorway associated with the round tower at that site, or a doorway of a church that is now no longer at that site. But again, fascinating Romanesque carvings on that building in a much later context. So again, looking at the idea that the Normans did it, the jury is kind of out on us. We can say the carvings most people would identify as Sheela-na-Gigs are definitely Norman context in a style that was popular on Norman influenced buildings, and Norman power is at the height at the same time Sheela-na-Gigs are at their height, or at the same time exhibitionist carving is at its height in Ireland. I would suggest that there is influence from Europe and England prior to the Normans arriving, either through masons working in Ireland or kind of travel back and forth between the two countries. So some of the earlier publications on Sheela-na-Gig probably propose some of the most logical explanations that we can come up with for these carvings. Although a warning of lust and these extremely grotesque carvings don't quite go together. This is generally proposed, or primarily originally proposed, by Anthony Weir and Germain. And look at the works of images of lust right across Europe, in France and Spain, primarily looking at pilgrimage routes. But I would be interested to see if we spread out our survey more and look at churches across all of these sites, what other exhibitionist carvings could we find across the continents. That again, if you're looking for something, you're likely going to find it in a certain area. And just because we produce a map of that doesn't mean that it's only in that area. The images that we see in the UK on the Corbel tables, and where a lot of the suggestions that Weir is making about teaching the laity the morals of the church or the sins, so images of lust being carved on these buildings to teach Christian values. You see these on Corbel tables in France, Spain, and England. We see very few existing Romanesque style Corbel tables in Ireland. We do see Sheela-na-Gigs appearing in acrobatic figures, which might be some of the earliest carvings that we have. But again, we can date some of these to the 15th century, so that becomes problematic. And we have this mixture of male and female carvings within that tradition. So one thing that, during the talks in this series, Roger Stalley gives on the high crosses, he says that the theory that the high crosses might have been used to teach an illiterate lay people about the scriptures can not really hold as much water when we look at that these are quite high carvings. They're out of sight a lot of the way, and you would need very good light. And this argument can be made towards the Sheela-na-Gigs itself. And Anthony Weir does allude to this problem himself in his own writings. But on the other side, we do see that Christian life and everyday lay life in medieval Ireland and England and France and Scotland, that they are ingrained with the church. So we see this in marker crosses, and certainly in the UK, that churches were part of the everyday life of medieval England. Activities such as community were often ingrained within the church. And this is kind of coming from Alex Woodcock's research on these kind of images on the margins and odd images that we would find in churches. You can see something like the marker cross at Athenry, which is churches, or which is symbols that we might not think are Christian, first of all. Things like griffins, things like Yale, which are two fighting beasts, intertwined dragons and beasts, antelope and other things. But all of these have at one time or another have been said to have a representation of a Christian message that is coming across. And again, we do see it in Christian iconography again and again. And this is why we started to include mermaids into the carvings, although they are much later into the tradition. Another argument that is often made is that Sheela-na-Gigs are some sort of protectionist symbol, a protection against the evil eye. This stone itself on Kilkea Castle in Kildare is known as the Evil Eye Stone. And, we have traditions of Sheela-na-Gigs having at least one in Carrick in County Kildare being called the Evil Eye Stone. Now we've lost that stone. We don't know where it is. So we can't say what was actually carved on it. But we do have this tradition that there was an Evil Eye Stone, and a lot of writers early on mentioned evil eyes and Sheela-na-Gigs. We have Sheela-na-Gigs with accessories, and Jorgen Andersen spends a little bit of time in his book talking about this. Now, some of these carvings Andersen wouldn't have ever seen, such as the Ballina Cluck one, which is the male figure very clearly symbolism of St. Peter holding the keys, but also a male figure holding his penis. We then have the second figure over, which is currently in Carlow. It's from Offaly originally, at least is what we're being told. That its find site was in Offaly and it migrates itself to a garden in Carlow. That carving and the Agado carving in County Cork both hold in their right hand a stick, a wand, a dagger, something. We can't figure it out, but both carvings hold something in their hand, and it looks like a small sword stick-like figure. The smaller Kiltinnan figure, the one on the well at the back of the castle, that figure holds a stick in one hand and a horseshoe in the other. Anderson argued that this wasn't a horseshoe, but we were lucky enough to get permission to go to that site to survey that carving, and it's very much a horseshoe. It's got little holes where the nails would go in as well. Freetag pointed out that the Lavallee carving and the Lixnaw carving, both of these circles over their arms, the Lavallee one, which is one of the Cavan carvings in the Cavan Museum, kind of looks like it's holding a balloon in its foot. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but there is this circle over its arm. And then the Lagavorian carving, which is in the Drogheda Museum, clearly has something hanging around its neck, which is descending down just behind its hands. And then if you go back and compare that to the second carving in this list, there is something hanging around that Sheela-na-Gig's neck and descending down. Initially, this looks like it could be a penis on a string to me, but that just might be me seeing phallic symbols everywhere after looking at Sheela-na-Gigs for too long. We see associations of protection marks with Sheela-na-Gigs. We see the carving just outside of Tuam, where it's got a number of marks which some people might link to pre-Christian, some people might link to protectionist symbols. And again, you're very much looking at iconography that shows up again and again in religious art on that carving. Beneath that, you have the Merlin Park carving, the smallest Sheela-na-Gig in Ireland, and until quite recently, one that was only known about for, say, it was the last carving that was found. And again, something showing up next to that carving, which can be used as a protectionist symbol. You have the Behe carving, which has these X's carved into the coin stone that it's on. And I couldn't find the image that I have, but there is another stone on that castle with that exact same X carved onto it. You have the evil eye stone, which is said to protect people from the evil eye, and the Kiltinnan Sheela-na-Gig holding up a horseshoe, sometimes said to be a protectionist symbol. You have a lot of carvings that are turned on their side on coins. You have carvings above doors and above windows. And we cannot really say if Sheela-na-Gigs are a warning against lust. If they're a protection on on evil eye, we cannot really say these things. One interesting thing that's been pointed out by two archaeologists separately, Con Manning in relation to carvings in Tipperary and Rory Sherlock in relation to carvings in Limerick, have both pointed out that churches and castles need protection not from evil spirits or forces, but from physical aggressive attacks. And if you go back to those carvings that were said to be the tyrannical owners of the castles, they could be projecting out to their enemies as well, as projection markers of these buildings are protected by this person. I think it's Sherlock who points out that a lot of the carvings that we see on the outside of buildings, and again, he's talking about Limerick here, that they're found over the stairs, which would be on the internal carving. And again, you can see that as Ballyfinboy in Tipperary, where the carving is literally outside the stairs, on Clock and Castle in County Roscommon. And this would be the very weak point of the castle, and often where castles failed under attack. So potentially an archaeological aspect of this protection could be that we're placing these carvings on the castle at their weakest points to kind of protect them. And this has been suggested on carvings that are found above doors and windows. The Doon example, which is that very large headed one just on the right hand side, kind of quite a squat body, and the legs between the hands between the legs. That carving is very much looks like it belongs in the place it is. But local tradition says that that carving was taken from a monastic site just down the road. So even when Sheela-na-Gigs look like they're in a primary location, we need to kind of understand that they might have been secondary. Potentially when the castle was being built, that they just took stones from the monastic site down the road and placed it into the castle. Freetag looks at the idea that the stones could be used for maternity. And again, as with all of these arguments, we can point to certain stones and we can say, oh, there's something interesting there. So she points out the Ballandary, the Dunanum, and the Top Boy carvings as having an amniotic sac, so the kind of afterbirth, and that this is what's being distended down. They've always looked like testicles to me on all three of those carvings. The Fawnstown, I think that's the name of the very faint one there, just at the bottom left. That one seems to have something distending down from its body as well. But that's a very worn carving. It was quite difficult to actually record. So again, we can point to certain carvings and say, these support these theories, but not all carvings tend to support those theories. And likely we could take all of those suggestions, the Normans gave it to us, the warnings of lust, that they're evil eye or protection on the castle, and say these could be possible origins for Sheela-na-Gigs. They could be what these figures were originally used for, and perhaps an amalgamation of a few of these, because if we're talking about carvings that exist from the 12th century to the 16th century, that's a long period of time, and they have chance to evolve and be reinterpreted by each generation that is using them. So where does the research go next? So my next kind of piece that's going to be published in hopefully not too distant future is looking at the similarity of carvings. So when we found the carving in Galway in 2017, immediately when I saw the carving, I figured that it looked like the Rahara carving from County Roscommon, and it looked like the Ballandary. And even when I was putting these slides together, I've identified another carving of a mermaid, which fits in with these three. When we look at the Cavan carving, again, it's in the Cavan Museum, we don't quite know where it came from. The carving from Westmeath, which is in the British Museum, and a carving in Wales, they have very similar features. And again, could we potentially look at the style of these carvings and attribute them to a group of masons, a school of masons, or a style that was happening around those times? So Teresa Oakley, in her research, Lifting the Veil, laid out a really good template for cataloguing the Sheela-na-Gigs, as in where are their hand positions, what's the size of the head, do they have hair, what do the ears look like, are they showing breasts, where are the breasts placed? So we're going to use that and expand on it to create our own catalogue, and then to analyze all of the carvings against each other to see then, do the 3D models show any common features within these carvings? As well as always looking for new angles of research, we are always finding new Sheela-na-Gigs. When Freetag published her book in 2014, she said 11 carvings that she published had not been looked at by other researchers. Now, they were pointed out to her by different historians and different people along the way. Some have been in private collections, some have been known about and published and recorded, but never included in Sheela-na-Gig books along the way. But if in 2014, there was 11 largely unknown carvings, there are more carvings out there. And since we started this project, we have found 6 exhibitionist figures. So in 2018, Brian McCabe found the carving at Tully, at County Kildare, which is in the local tourist office there for safekeeping. And I believe the public can view it upon request there. In Kilcooley, there's an etching on the door on the inside, likely graffiti. So this is what we've come to an understanding with the National Monuments, that we've placed it on the record, but not as a Sheela-na-Gig, but on the Kilcooley Abbey records, it says that this graffiti-looking carving, and we believe it is historical graffiti, as in when Kilcooley stops being used as a religious site, it's used as a home, and it's likely at that stage that this carving is placed in, because otherwise this would have been plastered over, and it's a very, very light carving onto the stone. The Moy Met carving, which is the very bottom right of this image, was published by Maureen Concannon in her book in 2004. I managed to record it this year while I was passing by the site. Very dubious, but I do think it fits with a Sheela-na-Gig, and looks like it could be a Sheela-na-Gig. It's very similar to other quite worn carvings from Abbeylar and Longford and a few other sites. 2 carvings in Galway, both I have to thank Christy Kniff for. One of these is in private ownership. We've published it and recorded it with the National Monuments, so they know about the location, and we've openly published the 3D model and as much information as we can give out about it. The second carving is at Cargin Church, just outside of Headford, and it's likely at this stage covered back over with ivy. But this is a male head, and this is what we were looking for, a male head with its tongue hanging out. And when we went to view it, it's clearly an exhibitionist figure with a penis underneath the corbel stone. The Jerpoint carving, which is the kind of image of sloth lying down, if you ask the OPW at Jerpoint, it's sloth. But if you look at Edwin Ray's article when he originally surveyed it, he mentions the exhibitionist nature of this carving. So again, we have a male exhibitionist figure, and again, at a very dateable site that we can actually say this is part of Jerpoint. Carvings always tend to show up, and I went to record this a couple of days ago. We're very much of two minds. It looks like an acrobatic figure. It could potentially be part of that wider exhibitionist classification, but we don't know the provenance. We have very, very few details on it, and we're still trying to research if it's an authentic carving, or if it's something that was made in more modern times. So yeah, I'm happy if people want to ask any questions to keep going for a little while.
Unfortunately, Gary, I think you've eliminated all of the questions that were pending there in the last hour and a bit. I've a couple of questions that I will just ask you, and if there's any more questions, pop them into the chat box. There's one there about, can Sheelas be grotesque rather than just female images?
The grotesque is a class of carving. So you see grotesque heads, and these are heads with kind of wrinkles underneath the neck. There are tattoo features, or what we call tattoo features on the face. So the term grotesque is a term used to style for a style of carving from the medieval period. So you can have carvings that are not Sheela-na-Gig that are still called grotesque, and some Sheela-na-Gigs which fit that collection. So the Feherd one, both the Feherd Sheela-na-Gigs are grotesque carvings. The Clonmel carving, which is the one on show in the museum, is grotesque. But the Rahara carving in Roscommon is not grotesque. It's actually a beautiful piece of artwork. The carving that we found in East Galway in 2017, it's a beautiful piece of stonework. It's not a grotesque style. It's probably high medieval carving that you would see the same thing of bishops and tombs and saints carved out of. So again, it's just a style of carving more than anything else. Thanks,
Gary. I've just given people the ability to unmute themselves there now. So if people want to jump in with a question, they'd be more than welcome. I have another one here that I picked up over the course of the lecture, which is one of the few, Gary, that you haven't answered already, which is, bearing in mind there have been no wooden Sheela-na-Gigs, is it possible that they were originally wooden figures?
I think yes, there is likely that there are exhibitionist figures carved in wood, and we do have examples in England on misericords, and we have them on roof bosses. and they are wooden figures, and they are exhibitionists, and some of those are female, so we can class them as Sheela-na-Gig. The problem with wooden figures in Ireland is large proportion of our churches don't have roofs, so there's no wood left in them. I still have to visit this site, but I keep meaning to go there and record everything. But Limerick Cathedral has a wonderful set of carved medieval features underneath the seats. So these would have been seats that the priest would have sat in, and they have one of those kind of spring-loaded seats that you'd find in a cinema. So when you're not sitting on it, there's this wonderful carving, and often of medieval beasts. There's Yales, there's Griffiths, there's kind of green men and other figures there. But when you sit on that, you obviously push that figure down to the ground. And again, this kind of feeds into the images of lust. So I think, yes, we could have had wooden carvings, but sadly, due to the church material in Ireland, they're all gone. But we do see them in the UK.
Thanks, Gary. There's one question there from Jerry Cutmore. Can you recommend a book on the subject? I know there's a number of books published.
I would almost recommend maybe a multitude of the books. Every book has its own little problem. If you want a very good discussion on Sheela-na-Gigs, to the most part, Freetag's book is very good. I think her argument on the maternity aspect is quite weak, but she lays out the history and gives some fantastic references. But again, as a catalogue, she drops a few of them. Jack Roberts' maps are probably the best catalogue, and Jack has published 2 books in the last number of years, which are almost as up to date as our carvings. We're slightly ahead of them. But I would say between Freetag and Jack Roberts, you probably have the best of both arguments or presentations of what's there. But honestly, I halfway through every single one of the books, I tend to put them down and just close my eyes for a minute, because in all of them, there is something I find very hard to agree with.
Yep, we frequently get that in history lectures here as well, Gary. It's not an exact science. So a question here from Roisin. Did you say there was a website that shows locations of all these carvings?
So there are a number of websites. The Sheela-na-Gig project is the UK one. Ireland's Sheela-na-Gigs is Gabriel Cannon's one for Ireland. And if you look, the sketchfab.com digital heritage age is where we're hosting the 3D models. We haven't released our map, which is an amalgamation of the work of Anthony Weir and John Harding together, just because some of the sites are private and we're using it as an active survey map. So hopefully at the end of this year, we'll be releasing that on a website linked to digitalheritageage.com.
Great. And thank you so much for that, Gary. I think we'll leave it there. We had a multitude of questions.
Liam, can I try?
If anyone else wants to jump in, absolutely. You have the ability to unmute there, so jump in yourselves. Yeah.
Can I try in one question? I've had the discussion with several people, and one older person who was quite good with the Irish suggested that the Sheela-na-Gig. No, he said it's actually Sheela-na-Gig. In other words, the outpouring from the breasts. Have you ever come across that?
I've come across it in reference. I think Etienne Rain and Ned Kelly have certainly suggested it, but nobody has proven that terminology would have been used in medieval Ireland. Generally, when it goes to Irish, I try and reach out to somebody from the Dictionary of Irish Language or somebody who understands medieval Irish better than I do. And all of them have pointed me in other directions whenever I come to something. But I do think there's a valid piece of research there to go looking at those suggested terms and see what the medieval terms would link up with, rather than, say, using Deneen's dictionary to give ourselves translations, which has been a problem with a lot of the research.
Thanks, Gary.
Gary, can I ask the question?
Yeah.
Just in terms of the dating of any of these material, in terms of dating the Sheelas, do you rely on understanding what the style was at a particular period of time, or is there a scientific way of interrogating the rock to tell when it was worked on and when it was positioned?
So largely it would be stylistic. So we would know certain styles only occur from certain periods. But in a number of cases, we are quite sure that the carving is in its original position on a number of churches. And we can date those churches either through historical documentation or archaeology. So like the nuns' church at Clonmacnoise, we know the year that church was built. We know who built it. We have a lot of information about that building.
Right.
In certain castles, we have dendrochronology dating of wicker work from those buildings. Mm-hmm. So it's a mixture of things, but largely when you date a Sheela-na-Gig, you're aiming for what does the carving look like? What do the tools look like? If it has punch dressing, that will place it in a very particular period. Sadly, those periods are 100 to 200 years. So we can't ever give exact dating outside of Kilpeck, which we can date to a date in the 1100s, and the Nuns' Chapel, which we can date to 1167. So
yeah. Your talk was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. Such a wealth of information. My head's melting. One question I had actually earlier on, and I kind of dropped my train of thought, was did you rule in or rule out the lust and fertility thing? Is it half in, half out?
I haven't ruled out lust just yet. I have ruled out fertility.
On what basis?
So the argument is made within Guest's research and links to Sheela-na-Gigs at wells and holy wells being associated with fertility. Every single Sheela-na-Gig at a well is in a secondary position, and largely carvings that are associated with Sheela-na-Gigs, such as there's one in Cork, I just can't think of the name. I think it's not Castle Windingham, it's another one. That carving is not a Sheela-na-Gig. Potentially St. Bridget, which makes it slightly more interesting, but that came from a church and we know roughly where it came from. So if the association with wells is secondary, then the association with fertility is secondary. But I do bow then to the folk tales that there is folk tradition that says these things were used as fertility, and I think that might be a secondary use of the carvings or a secondary association, which is always welcome in the research. So,
how about the idea that we don't have the archaeological record of their origins? This is just a wild thing, right? How about they were fertility symbols out of wood, and they became kind of how would you say, a talisman and associated with look, almost like a horseshoe over a door because in a house, and half the time people don't even know why it's there. And it became a habit to put these grotesques or whatever you call them. It sort of developed over from pagan and brought into Christian and then brought in. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm not really.
Yeah, I will happily agree to that if somebody finds a clear Sheela-na-Gig carving at a site dating to the Iron Age, Bronze Age, or Neolithic, but that has never happened. We have found wooden carvings from the Iron Age. So we've even scanned a few of them, but they are not Sheela-na-Gigs. They're very much part of a different type of tradition. And you can see a few of them in the museum in Dublin, largely of male carvings.
The hole in the middle, those ones?
There's, the hole in the middle again might be people looking at phallic stones a bit too much. That's the Ballycoolish one where they said she was found with a lot of detached penises around her. I have my thoughts on that. But no, if somebody can find a dateable wooden figure that is a Sheela-na-Gig inside of an Iron Age context, I will say, yes, there are pre-Christian carvings. I'll never say there's pagan, because I don't think there is anything called pagan. There is a religion of the day, and we just don't understand it. And attributing the word pagan to something we don't understand is always a problem for me. I think it would be interesting to see, is there any connections, but I don't think anything but for the 1100s we can date any of these style of carvings.
Thank you very much.
Gary, hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, Gary, just a question there. I've no experience of the Irish Sheela-na-Gigs, but I've seen a couple in Scotland. One's on the Church of St. Clement's at Rodel in Harris. And it's been reported that it shows the figure possibly feeding either a child or an animal, maybe a lamb or whatever. Is that common? I mean, that you would see this, you know, mothering aspect as opposed to what we perceive to be the lewd aspect?
No. There is one carving in Ireland I almost thought I saw it breastfeeding. And I went back and I re-recorded it, and then I was less happy that I'd seen what I thought I saw. I will go back at some point with a cherry picker, and I will get up close enough to record it in high detail. But I don't think it is. I think it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But that would have been exciting. It would have been an interesting find. I'm trying to picture the Rodel one in my head, but I don't think it's depicting feeding or anything like that. There's a couple of the Scottish carvings that are quite unusual. That's you'd wonder, do they properly fit within the Sheela-na-Gig tradition?
Yeah, the one in St. Clement's certainly has more than just the female Sheela-na-Gig. It has what's called the lewd man, which is a figure of a man naked from the waist down, it would seem. It's also got a bull's head, which is the Clan MacLeod insignia. Now, Rodel, St. Clement's Church was built in 1500, but someone suggested to me that, in fact, the positioning of those figures is such that it probably came from an earlier church.
It certainly looks like that. I've just pulled it up here from my records. It certainly does look like that. It's very, very likely, although I think that church has been repaired a few times, just looking at the work within it.
Yeah, it was largely overhauled in the 1800s, I believe, yeah.
Yeah, the carving's quite interesting in that it could be a jug. She could be pouring water. It could be a pair of bagpipes. Although that gets explained away for everything in Scotland that we can't, that they're holding bagpipes. There is one carving in Ireland. It's in Sligo, at Moygarra Castle, and it's sometimes classed as an exhibitionist figure. And I think it is a person playing pipes. It's a dancer playing pipes in an exhibitionist position with one leg up behind its head, exposing itself. So it could be that. I don't see it as a breastfeeding figure.
Well, I think in some pages that have been put on the web, they've suggested that. I've never seen it to be that myself when I've looked at it. In fact, I can't make out anything other than some sort of square to the top left-hand side of it.
Yeah.
But there's also one which I find interesting on the island of Iona. It's on the nunnery, on the wall of the nunnery.
Yes.
Why, it just seems almost as if it's there to remind them about piety.
That's generally the suggestion for it, I think. I'm trying to remember what Rosemary Power concluded on that one. And I think she comes from that order of nuns.
Augustinian.
Yeah, I think here in Galway, she used to look after a church out here in Connemara whenever she was in the country. But yeah, it's an interesting carving. Some people say it isn't. Some people say it is a Sheela-na-Gig. But again, it's that kind of teaching the people of the church, or teaching the lay people to remember their place.
Yeah.
And I do think there's some kind of reason behind that, or a reasoning behind that it does make a little bit of sense. The other thing to note, again, just there's always a counter argument to these things, is that the idea of the book of images, or the Masons books, has largely been disproven at this stage. I think it's Alex Woodcock who says that in his PhD, that this idea that Masons were going around with books and they had these images that explained morality, and that these things could be put on churches, that has largely been disproven. Actually, I think it's one of those little Shire books on grotesques. He wrote one of those, and it's based on his PhD research. But it's one of the pages in that he makes that kind of statement, that again, this has been disproven. So while it's interesting, others have disproved it, and I still won't take it away from the possibility that is what they're used for. Again and again, it's the logical thing that pops into my head. That seems to be the most logical explanation for them.
Just finally, you probably know that Roslin Chapel has got more carvings than you can shake a stick at, but there's not one. There's not one Sheela-na-Gig.
No, but
plenty of green men.
Yeah, I think Roslин's quite late, and it's outside of the church, as in it's a private chapel, isn't it?
It's a private chapel, yeah.
I
built
was
in the
looking,
1800s.
When I lived in Scotland, I had the opportunity to work with the Digital Design Studio and the Historic Scotland while they were doing some of the work up at Roslin, scanning it. So I've seen some of the amazing stuff up there. And I do plan to visit sometime. But yeah, I think there's enough researchers on that site to say that it is a bit later, and I think I'm going to leave it to them. So,
Gary, I'd just like to say thanks a million for a fantastic lecture. You managed to comprehensively answer all of the questions that were answered within the talk by the end of the talk, which is brilliant. It was a great lecture. Really enjoyed it. Fascinating topic, and thank you so much for coming on Sheela-na-Gig. There's been a couple of requests for additional information, so if you send them on to me, we'll pop them into the Sheela-na-Gig event over the next couple of days. So thank you so much. Really enjoyed it, and we'd love to have you back again whenever you're free.
Yep, thanks, Liam. That's great.
Bye, everybody. Thanks a lot.
I know.